The cold Chicago wind rattled the school's windows as Maria stared at the empty safe in her office. The silence broken only by the frantic scratching of a pen on a cancellation notice. Every donor contact, every cent of the life-saving funds, and the very venue for the operations gala had vanished overnight, replaced by a single, familiar scent of expensive lilies lingering in the sterile air. Just as she reached for the phone, her husband's voice crackled through the intercom, not with comfort, but with a cold, rehearsed accusation that made her blood run cold. Across the street, her mother-in-law stood on her manicured porch, calmly sipping tea while watching the school through binoculars. A trash bag sat at her feet, stuffed with the missing ledgers and a shredded guest list. As Maria stepped out into the freezing rain, she realized the person she shared her bed with was no longer on her side. And the woman who lived next door wasn't just a nuisance. She was a predator who had just closed the trap. If Maria didn't find a way to fight back by dawn, a child's heart would stop beating, and her own life would be nothing more than a ghost story told in the hallways. The boy's breath hitched when Maria pressed the gauze too hard, his fingers clawing at the edge of the exam table. A thin line of blood welled up along the fresh stitches, dark as engine oil. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear on her sleeve, another stain to add to the collection. "Hold still," she murmured, though she knew he wouldn't. His knee bounced like a metronome set to the wrong tempo, the sole of his sneakers scuffing against the linoleum. The sound grated, a rhythmic scrape that matched the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The air in the tiny nurse's office at Englewood High felt thick and stagnant, a cocktail of industrial-grade bleach and the sour, metallic tang of unwashed hair. Outside the frosted glass of her door, the muffled chaos of the hallways continued. Shouts, the metallic bang of lockers, the restless energy of a Friday afternoon in a neighborhood that didn't promise many Saturdays. "You're gonna mess it up," the boy muttered, his voice raw. It wasn't a complaint, just a weary observation of fact. His nails were bitten to the quick, the cuticles red and angry. Maria reached for the antiseptic spray, the can hissing like a snake when she pressed the nozzle. He flinched, his body tensing as if expecting a blow rather than medicine. She worked quickly, her movements precise and practiced, her hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion beginning to settle in her joints. "Well, look," she said, her voice dropping to that soft, instructional tone she used to keep them from bolting. "James, you're better today. Your temperature is almost normal, but you're fragile, like glass. And glass is easy to break. Once it's broken, you can't just glue it back together." She was talking about more than the stitches. James, barely 10 but carrying the weight of a man 3 times his age, looked at the floor. He didn't have to tell her about the fight or the empty bottles in his kitchen. The bruises on his ribs and the way he flinched at loud noises told the story for him. Maria felt the familiar, heavy pull in her chest. The desire to fix everything, and the crushing knowledge that she was just one woman with a first aid kit in a building that was falling apart. When she finally finished bandaging the wound, her fingers lingered for a second on his shoulder. He stood up, his oversized hoodie swallowing his thin frame, and shuffled toward the door. She watched him go, then turned to her desk, where a medical file lay open. A thick red line was drawn under a figure with too many zeros. It was a cardiac surgery estimate. James didn't just need stitches. He needed a miracle that cost more than her house. The silence of the office felt suddenly deafening. She picked up a pen, her knuckles white as she gripped it, and began to sketch out a plan. A fundraiser. A gala. Something big enough to force the city to look at a boy who had been invisible for 10 years. She felt a surge of fear, a cold prickle at the back of her neck. but she ignored it. She couldn't afford to be quiet anymore. The transition from the sterile, humming school office to the suffocating order of her apartment was always a jolt to the system. As Maria turned the key in the lock, she didn't find the sanctuary she craved. Instead, the air was heavy with a familiar, cloying scent. Expensive face powder and lilies. She stopped in the doorway of her bedroom. Evelyn was there, her back to Maria, her movements sharp and proprietary. The older woman was methodically removing Maria's silk blouses from their hangers and stacking them on the bottom shelf of the wardrobe. "Evelyn?" Maria's voice was thin. "Oh, Maria, you're home late," Evelyn said without turning around. She smoothed a wrinkle out of a sleeve with a gesture that felt like a rebuke. "I was just helping. This closet is a disaster. A man like Mark needs a home that reflects his status, not a chaotic storeroom." Maria gripped her keys so hard the metal bit into her palm. She watched as Evelyn reached for her perfume bottles, lining them up in a rigid, soulless row on the dresser. It was an invasion, a slow-motion annexation of her life. "I didn't ask for help with the laundry, Evelyn." "You shouldn't have to ask," Evelyn replied, finally turning. Her eyes were as cold as the Lake Michigan wind. She ran a finger along the top of the dresser and held it up, inspecting a speck of dust that wasn't there. Family takes care of its own, even when some members are too distracted to do their part. The sound of the front door opening signaled Mark's arrival. He walked in, his shoulders slumped, his face already wearing the mask of weary neutrality he used to navigate the war zone of his home. He looked at the open drawers, then at his mother, and finally at Maria. "Mark, look," Maria said, her voice trembling. "Your mother is going through our things again." Mark didn't look at the drawers. He looked at the floor, at the pattern of the rug, anywhere but at the conflict. "Maria, she's just trying to help. She's been here all day cleaning. You've been at the school since 6. He stepped forward and took Maria's elbow, his touch soft but lacking any real strength. "Maybe you should just thank her. She does it because she loves us." Evelyn smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of the lips that didn't reach her eyes. She moved past them into the hallway, her presence lingering like a bad taste. Maria felt a wall of glass rising between her and Mark. Transparent, cold, and impenetrable. He was choosing the path of least resistance, and that path always led straight to his mother's feet. The weight of the house felt unbearable, so Maria retreated into her work. The fundraiser for James became her obsession, a way to channel the anger she couldn't express at the dinner table. She spent her nights at the kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and charity proposals, while Mark sat in the living room, the silence between them growing like a physical barrier. A few nights later, she tried to reclaim some semblance of their marriage. She spent hours preparing a roast duck, lighting candles, and wearing a dress she hadn't touched in a year. The table looked beautiful. The wine was poured. And for a moment, the apartment felt like it belonged to them. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't a guest. It was a summons. Evelyn stood on the landing, her face a mask of practiced distress. She ignored Maria entirely, reaching past her to grab Mark's hand. "Mark, darling, the faucet in the guest bathroom. It's spraying everywhere. I'm going to have a flood. I didn't know who else to call." Mark looked at the duck, then at Maria's face, and then at his mother's trembling hands. "I'll be right back, Maria. I have to. It'll only take a minute." Maria watched them leave, the door clicking shut with a finality that made her heart ache. She sat at the table alone. The candles flickered and died, and the fat on the duck congealed into a white, greasy film. In the distance, through the thin walls, she could hear Evelyn's voice. Loud, commanding, directing Mark's every move in the house next door. The next morning, Maria didn't wait for Evelyn to comment on the waste of the dinner. She went straight to the school, her jaw set. She had a meeting with the local business alliance, a group of men who held the purse strings of the neighborhood. She stood at the head of a long, polished table in a conference room that smelled of expensive leather and stale coffee. She didn't lead with statistics. She laid out the photos of the school's crumbling hallways and the medical reports for James. "Well, look," she began, her voice steady. "I'm not here to ask for a handout. I'm here to ask you to invest in a life. James is 10. He has a heart that's failing him, but his spirit is stronger than anyone's in this room. If we don't act, he becomes another statistic. If we do, he becomes a neighbor." One of the men, a developer who had bought up half the block, leaned back and smirked. "It's a lot of money, Mrs. Reynolds, for one kid. How do we know the funds are handled properly?" Maria didn't blink. She met his gaze with a ferocity that made him shift in his seat. "Because I'm the one handling them. And because if you don't help, I'll make sure every person in this district knows exactly who turned their back on a dying child." The room went silent. She could feel the shift in the air, the transition from skepticism to a grudging, wary respect. By the time she left, she had 3 solid pledges and the promise of a venue. She felt a spark of hope, a warmth she hadn't felt in months. But Evelyn was already weaving a different narrative. A few days later, Maria was walking through the school's main hall when she saw a cluster of teachers huddled near the faculty lounge. In the center was Evelyn, her voice low and conspiratorial, her face twisted into an expression of profound pity. "It's just so hard," Evelyn was saying, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. "I go over there and the refrigerator is empty. Mark is losing weight. She's so obsessed with this project that she's forgotten she has a husband. I'm the one who has to do the laundry, can you imagine? I worry about her mind, I really do." The teachers looked up as Maria approached, their expressions a mix of pity and judgment. Evelyn didn't flinch. She turned to Maria and smiled, a sugary, poisonous expression. "Oh, Maria, there you are. I was just telling your colleagues how proud we are of your little hobby. Even if it does take you away from home so much." Maria felt a cold, oily shame slide down her spine. Every word was a needle, precisely aimed to deflate her reputation. She wanted to scream, to tell them about the duck in the closet and the way Evelyn was suffocating her marriage. But the words died in her throat. She was a professional. She couldn't descend to Evelyn's level. She simply walked past, her back rigid, feeling the weight of their stares. The pressure only intensified as the date of the fundraiser approached. The city's local press had picked up the story, and Maria found herself in the middle of a media whirlwind. Flashes of cameras blinded her at the school gates. Journalists thrust microphones into her face. "Mrs. Reynolds, how does it feel to lead such a massive campaign?" "I'm just doing my job," she told them, her voice tight. In the background of the news footage, she could see the banner she'd had made. James's face, pale but smiling, hanging over the school entrance. It was working. The city was listening. But at home, the atmosphere was toxic. Mark had become a ghost in his own house, moving from room to room with a look of mounting resentment. One evening, as Maria was trying to finalize the auction list, he snatched her laptop and slammed it shut. "Enough!" he shouted. The sound was so jarring in the quiet apartment that Maria flinched. "My mother is right. You're never here. And when you are, you're staring at this screen. People are talking, Maria. They're saying you're doing this for the glory, not for the kid. They're saying that because your mother is telling them to. Maria snapped back, her voice rising for the first time. Mark, look. She's trying to destroy this. She wants me to fail, so I'll go back to being the quiet little wife who lets her pick out our curtains. She's my mother. Mark's face was flushed, his eyes wild with a conflict he couldn't resolve. She's the only one who cares about this family. You're out there saving the world, and our house is falling apart. He stormed out, the front door rattling in its frame. Maria sat in the dark, the silence of the apartment feeling like a physical weight. She realized then that Evelyn wasn't just attacking her work. She was using Mark as a weapon, poisoning his mind until he saw Maria's strength as a betrayal. The sabotage moved from the personal to the professional with terrifying speed. The following Monday, Maria arrived at the school to find her office door slightly ajar. The lock had been forced, the metal plate scratched and bent. Inside, the room was a ruin. Her files had been dumped onto the floor, her desk drawers overturned. She scrambled to the small floor safe where she kept the foundation's legal documents and the original sponsor pledges. It was empty. The blue folder, the one containing the signed contracts worth $50,000, was gone. A faint, lingering scent hung in the air, the smell of lilies and expensive powder. Maria sank into her chair, her legs giving way. It wasn't just a theft, it was a declaration of war. She didn't have time to process the loss before she was summoned to the principal's office. Mr. Harris was sitting behind his desk, looking deeply uncomfortable. Across from him, Evelyn sat in a leather chair, a lace handkerchief pressed to her eyes. "Maria," Mr. Harris said, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Reynolds Sr. has brought some concerning matters to my attention. She's worried about your mental state. She's described some erratic behavior at home, outbursts, forgetfulness." "I am perfectly fine," Maria said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "She's just so stressed." Evelyn sobbed into her handkerchief, though Maria could see her sharp, observant eyes over the fabric. "She's been losing things, important papers. I'm afraid she's not herself. For the safety of the school's reputation. Perhaps she should step back from the financial side of the fundraiser." Maria looked at the principal. She saw the doubt in his eyes. Evelyn had been a donor to the school for years. Her word carried weight that Maria's salary never would. "Well, look," Maria started, but Harris held up a hand. "For now, Maria, we're going to have the school board's accountant oversee the funds. And I'm going to need you to take a few days of administrative leave. Just to rest." Maria walked out of the office in a daze. The world was tilting on its axis. By the time she reached her car, her phone was buzzing. It was one of her primary sponsors, a local philanthropist. "Maria, I just received an anonymous packet. It contains copies of bank statements. They show some very strange transfers from the foundation account to your personal one. Until this is cleared up, I'm withdrawing my support." "That's impossible," Maria cried, but the line was already dead. Evelyn had thought of everything. She hadn't just stolen the files, she had planted evidence. She was methodically dismantling Maria's life, piece by piece, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage. The final blow came on Thursday, 48 hours before the gala. Maria drove to the downtown banquet hall to check on the catering arrangements, only to find the manager looking at her with confusion. "The Reynolds event?" "It was canceled this morning, ma'am. A woman calling herself the family's representative called and said the funds had fallen through. She authorized the release of the deposit." Maria felt a coldness settle in her bones that no heater could touch. She described Evelyn, and the manager nodded. Yes, that sounds like the lady. Very elegant, very firm. Maria stood in the middle of the empty, echoing ballroom. The space she had envisioned, filled with music and hope, was now just a cavernous room that smelled of floor wax. Evelyn had won. She had cut off the money, the reputation, and now the very ground beneath Maria's feet. She drove home in a state of icy, crystalline clarity. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She walked into her apartment and found Mark and Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table, sharing a pot of tea as if they were celebrating a quiet victory. "Maria, dear," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "I heard about the banquet hall. What a shame. But perhaps it's for the best. Now you can focus on being a wife again." Maria didn't answer. She went into the bedroom and began to pack a bag. Not for a trip, but for a war. The Sunday dinner was an institution in the Reynolds family, a weekly ritual of forced civility and Evelyn's undisputed reign. This Sunday, however, was different. Evelyn had invited the inner circle, the principal, a few board members, and the wealthiest neighbors, under the guise of a consolation dinner for her poor, misguided daughter-in-law. The dining room was a theater of opulence. The scent of roasted rosemary and heavy red wine hung in the air, thick enough to choke on. Maria sat at the far end of the table, a ghost at her own execution. Evelyn was in rare form, holding court at the head of the table, her pearls gleaming under the crystal chandelier. "It's a tragedy, really," Evelyn told the table, her voice a theatrical whisper. "Maria has such a big heart. But her nerves, they just weren't up to the task. The confusion with the funds, the loss of the contracts. It's been a heavy burden for my Mark to bear." Mark sat next to her, his head bowed, his fork moving listlessly over his plate. He looked like a man who had already surrendered. Maria felt the bile rise in her throat. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The conversation died instantly. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She walked out into the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew Evelyn's habits. The older woman never went anywhere without her command center, a massive crocodile skin handbag that she kept within arm's reach. But tonight, in her arrogance, she had left it hanging on the brass hook in the darkened foyer. Maria reached for it. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was iron. She unzipped the heavy gold fastener. Inside, tucked behind a silk scarf and a silver pillbox, were the blue folders. She pulled them out, her breath hitching. They were all there, the original contracts, the uncashed checks, and something else. A small black leather ledger. Maria flipped it open. It was a meticulous record of Evelyn's investments. Payments made to a local printer for the forged bank statements, notes on which board members to influence, and a copy of the cancellation order for the banquet hall, signed in Evelyn's sharp, aggressive hand. A sound behind her made her freeze. "What are you doing?" It was Mark. He was standing in the shadows of the hallway, his face pale. "Look," Maria whispered, thrusting the ledger into his hands. "Mark, look at this. Your mother didn't help me. She destroyed me. She stole the money for James's surgery. She forged my signature. She canceled the hall." Mark looked at the book, his eyes scanning the pages. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. She said you were sick. She said you were losing your mind." "I'm not the one who's sick, Mark." From the dining room, Evelyn's voice rang out, sharp and demanding. "Mark, Maria, what is taking so long? The duck is getting cold." Maria took the documents from Mark's limp hands. She felt a surge of power, a cold, white light of fury that burned away the last of her hesitation. She didn't sneak back in. She marched. She threw the blue folder into the center of the table. It landed in the middle of a silver platter of roasted vegetables, splashing oil onto the white lace cloth. "Well, look," Maria said, her voice echoing in the sudden, shocked silence. "I found the lost contracts. They were in Evelyn's purse." Evelyn's face went from pale to a mottled, sickly gray. She stood up, her hand flying to her throat. "Maria, how dare you? That is my private property. Mark, tell her." But Maria wasn't finished. She pulled out a small digital recorder she'd taken from her own office weeks ago, one she'd used for interviews. She'd found it in the bag, too. She hit play. Evelyn's voice, cold and unmistakable, filled the room. "I don't care about the boy. I want her gone. Cancel the haul. Tell the sponsors she's skimming. If she has nothing left, she'll have to come back to heal." The silence that followed was absolute. The principal looked at the table, his face turning a deep, shamed red. The neighbors looked at their plates. Evelyn turned to Mark, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic light. "Mark, darling, it's a trick. She's faked it. She's trying to turn you against your own mother." Mark stood in the doorway. He looked at the woman who had raised him, who had controlled every breath he took since he was 8 years old. Then he looked at Maria, who was standing tall, her eyes burning with a fire he'd never seen before. He walked to the head of the table. He didn't look at the guests. He looked at Evelyn. "Get out," he said. His voice was low, but it had a weight that cut through Evelyn's hysterics like a knife. "Mark, you can't mean—" "I said get out," he roared. He grabbed her coat from the chair and threw it at her. "Go to your house. Stay there. If I see you near Maria again, I'm calling the police with everything in that book." Evelyn stood frozen for a second, her mask finally, irrevocably shattered. She looked around the table, but there was no support left. She was a queen without a kingdom. She grabbed her coat and fled, the sound of her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood until the front door slammed shut. Maria didn't wait for the apologies of the guests. She turned to the principal. "The fundraiser is back on, tomorrow night. But we're not using a ballroom." "Where?" Harris asked, his voice shaking. "The school," Maria said. "Where it belongs." The next 24 hours were a blur of adrenaline and sheer, stubborn will. Maria didn't go home. She went to the school. She called the Parents' Association, the local unions, the neighborhood watch. "Well, look," she told them into the phone, her voice raw but steady. "The fancy hall is gone, but we have a gym, and we have each other. If you can cook, bring food. If you can carry a chair, show up at 6. By midnight, the school gym was a hive of activity. Students were hanging streamers, parents were setting up folding tables. The smell of floor wax was replaced by the aroma of fried chicken, spicy empanadas, and slow-cooked ribs as the neighborhood's mama's kitchens emptied their pantries. Mark was there, too. He didn't say much, but he spent the night hauling speakers and setting up the stage. When he finally approached Maria, his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "We'll talk about sorry later," Maria said, handing him a box of decorations. "Right now, we have a boy to save." The night of the event, the gym was packed. It wasn't the Grand Plaza. There was no marble, no crystal, no hushed conversations. It was loud, it was hot, and it was alive. The inner circle of donors showed up too, driven by a mix of guilt and the realization that the power in the neighborhood had shifted. Maria stood on the small wooden stage in the center of the court. She looked out at the faces, the teachers who had doubted her, the parents who had prayed with her, and James, sitting in the front row, his eyes wide and bright. "Well, look," she said into the microphone, and the room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the old heaters. "They told us this wasn't the right place. They told us we didn't have the right image. But this is Englewood. We don't need a ballroom to take care of our own." The applause was a physical force, a roar that shook the rafters. By the end of the night, the total on the chalkboard didn't just meet the goal, it shattered it. They had enough for the surgery, the recovery, and a scholarship fund for the school. As the crowd began to thin and the cleanup started, Maria walked to the high windows of the gym. Outside, across the street, she saw a car parked in the shadows. A lone figure stood by the driver's side door, watching the lights of the school. It was Evelyn. She looked small, diminished, a shadow against the backdrop of a community that had moved on without her. Maria didn't feel triumph. She felt a profound, quiet peace. She felt the weight of 12 years old, the girl whose father told her she demanded too much, finally lift from her shoulders. She had demanded a life for a child, and she had received it. Mark came up behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. This time, she didn't flinch. She didn't feel the glass wall. "It's time to go home," he said. "Yes," Maria replied, looking at the empty stage and the mess of a successful battle. "But it's going to be a different home, Mark. My home, not hers." "I know," he said. They walked out together into the cool Chicago night, leaving the echoes of the gym behind. For the first time in her life, Maria Reynolds wasn't afraid of being burdensome. She was exactly where she needed to be.